If you have osteoporosis, you have probably at some point been told, don't bend or don't flex. And that can be hard to figure out how to manage, and it's not entirely accurate. I'm Alison Crouch from the Move Smart Method for Osteoporosis, and I'm here to talk about how we can bend and flex and do it well and safely and effectively. And it is the magic trick for getting stuff done in your life and building hip strength and leg strength and helping your pelvic floor and saving your spine. And it is the magic of the hip hinge. So the reason that we are frequently told not to bend is because we're trying to avoid, look out for cat, we're trying to avoid or limit sustained, rapid, forceful, end range, weighted, so really extreme kinds of forward flexion in our spines, because that can be a contributing factor to vulnerability to fracture in our spines. It does not mean that we are never going to move our spines. It does not mean we are never going to flex, because, real life dictates that sometimes we're going to flex. But we want to be able to have other alternatives for movement. And the hip hinge is a spectacular source for movement. So when people say, you need to not bend or you want to limit bending, they're talking about bending at the spine, right? So I have pretty advanced osteoporosis, and you'll notice I am okay with doing a little bit of bending. This is not end range, it's not extreme, it's not rapid, it's not forceful, and I don't do it all the time. So it's not a big cumulative part of the motion that I do during the day. And that's because I frequently use a hip hinging strategy, both in exercise and in my daily life. So let's talk about what's a hip hinge. Hip hinging is literally that, where you take your hip joints and you hinge them. So you're moving your pelvis over top of your leg bones, around the top of your leg bones, without also moving your spine. And this is where, for some of us, it gets complicated, because we start with a hinge and then we maybe don't have as much awareness, or we don't have as much mobility in our hips, and we end up starting with a hinge and finishing with flexion. And this is now no longer a hip hinge. This is now a combination of hip hinge and flexion through your spine. So we want to learn how to be more precise and more specific with our hip hinging so that we can use it in lots of different applications. So how do we know if we are doing both a hip hinge and a spinal flexion? We use a little external tool. So you have a broomstick or a dowel or a mop handle or something like that. And you get it so that it is really nicely set onto the back of your sacrum, onto your bra strap, and then as much as possible of the rest of your spine, and potentially even the back of your head. If you get too focused on the back of your head, what can end up happening is this, where you're now thrusting your ribs forward so that you can get your head and your pelvis on, and now we don't get a great assessment of your spine staying solid. So I'm more interested in this connection here at the base of your ribs and your shoulder blades and your pelvis. So if your head needs to come forward, that's okay, don't worry about it. And then from there, plant your legs a little bit wider than hip distance apart. Probably bend your knees a little bit. Is going to make this an easier thing to do. And then from there, you hinge forward at your hips, and you go only as far as you can go without either losing this connection to the center of your sacrum or losing the connection at your bra strap and your shoulder blades. So that you don't either go like that, where now the bottom of the broomstick is no longer in contact with your pelvis, or you go like that, where now your rib cage has come through. In both of those cases, we've now lost the hip hinge function. So your hip hinge might just be here. And that's great. We don't need to go really, really far in the starting stages, right? You can start out pretty slow. So that would be fine. and really be intentional about keeping these parts of your trunk connected to the broomstick until you feel like you've really got the hang of it. Most people are going to do better with a little bit of a knee bend than with a straight leg. Once you've kind of got the sense of what that is, we have a couple of strategies to use it as a building up, kind of warming up process. And that would be a supported hip hinge. So here you could have your legs straight, or you could have your legs a little bit bent, but you're really thinking about getting, like, imagine you're wearing a pair of jeans. You want the bottom of your jeans pockets to be sending back towards the corner where the wall and the ceiling meet, right? They don't need to be up towards the wall behind you, but we're trying to avoid that tucked position. And you just hang out. And depending on how tall you are, or how snug the backs of your hips are, you might need to come up higher, right? You'd have yoga blocks or bolster, or you're using a table instead of a chair, or you could use the back of the chair, right? And come here or here. As long as you're getting this sense of a corner, and again, you can have your knees bent if you have tighter hamstrings, that there's a corner happening at your hips and not a half circle. So then how do we apply that in an exercise context? Now we're thinking about using it for a working hip hinge. So this would be leading into deadlifting, where you have your shins nice and stable. You can have a bend to your knees. You would have weights in your hands maybe. And then you slide down only as far as you can go with this nice hinged, not rib thrusty position. And then you use your hips to drive back up. But the place I really love hip hinging for us is just in everyday life. So if you think about loading the dishwasher, instead of coming in and rounding to put the plates in the dishwasher, you have a little bit of a knee bend and you hip hinge. When you want to pick something up off the floor, instead of rounding your spine, you have a hip hinge. You can do kind of a single leg hip hinge, right? So you want to come down and pick something up. We're hinging at our hips. We're building strength in the backs of our legs and the backs of our hips. This kind of movement is incredibly helpful for your pelvic floor because it strengthens and lengthens all the muscles in the backs of your hips. So that's kind of a nice side bonus. And it means that as we go through the day, we are not unintentionally and unmeaningfully adding more and more flexion to our spines. So we save our flexion time for the things that we love. So if we really want to do something that involves some flexion, and for things like if you're looking after your grandbabies and you need to flex to get them out of the crib, you can do that knowing that you have created lots of extra space in your day for flexion by replacing flexion motions with hip hinging motions. So I just want to be super clear before I go that hip hinging is amazing and is a fantastic strategy, and it helps to limit the amount of time we spend in flexion that we might not need to be in, and that we're not fear-mongering here, that it is okay to have mobility in our spines. We're not eliminating flexion, and we're getting stronger and more confident and competent and adept by using hip hinge strategies, both in exercise and in everyday life. So give it a try. Pop into the comments down below. Let me know how it goes. See you next time.